They say ghosts don't exist on the battlefield, but Marines in Fallujah knew better. They had seen her work. A shadow that moved through enemy lines like smoke through ruins, leaving behind only silence and the scattered remains of insurgent positions that had been terrorizing their patrols for weeks. No radio chatter, no muzzle flash, no trace of her presence except for the enemies who simply stopped breathing. She wore no uniform they recognized, carried no identification, and answered to no chain of command. Yet when Staff Sergeant Maria Santos appeared at their forward operating base, with her weathered rifle and eyes that had seen too much, every Marine from private to colonel found themselves standing a little straighter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. There was something about her that commanded respect without demanding it, a quiet authority that spoke louder than any rank insignia ever could. The legend began with whispers in the chow halls and spread through encrypted communications across the theater. A sniper who could eliminate targets from impossible distances, who moved through hostile territory like she owned it, who appeared whenever Marines were in trouble and vanished the moment the threat was neutralized. Some called her an angel of death, others simply called her salvation. But Maria Santos knew she was neither. She was just a woman who had lost everything that mattered and found her purpose in the crosshairs of her rifle scope. The morning sun painted the concrete barriers of Camp Lejeune in shades of amber and gold. But Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison felt nothing but gray frustration as he reviewed the personnel files scattered across his desk. 6 months into his command of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment, and he was still dealing with what his predecessor had diplomatically called irregularities in operational protocols. Morrison was a career Marine who believed in order, structure, and the kind of military precision that made the Corps the most feared fighting force on the planet. He had earned his rank through 22 years of exemplary service, following every regulation to the letter and expecting the same from his subordinates. The idea that someone could operate outside the established chain of command while somehow contributing to mission success was not just foreign to him, it was offensive. The file he held belonged to Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, though calling it a personnel file was generous. Half the pages were redacted, classified at levels that required clearances Morrison didn't possess. What he could read painted a picture of a sniper with capabilities that bordered on the supernatural, but also raised questions about accountability and proper military procedure that kept him awake at night. Santos had appeared at Forward Operating Base Warrior in Iraq's Anbar province 18 months earlier, carrying orders that seemed to have materialized from thin air and bore signatures from offices that officially didn't exist. She had no assigned unit, no direct superior, and no clearly defined mission parameters. Yet within weeks of her arrival, enemy sniper activity in the region had decreased by 70%, and Marine casualties from precision enemy fire had dropped to nearly zero. The reports Morrison could access described a woman who moved through the battlefield like a predator, eliminating high-value targets with a precision that defied conventional understanding of sniper capabilities. She operated alone, communicated through encrypted channels that bypassed normal command structures, and seemed to anticipate enemy movements with an accuracy that suggested either extraordinary intelligence gathering or something approaching precognition. What disturbed Morrison most was not her effectiveness, but the way she had earned the respect of his Marines without ever formally joining their ranks. He had read after-action reports from squad leaders who described her appearing during firefights like a guardian spirit, eliminating threats that had pinned down their units and disappearing before they could properly thank her. Enlisted men spoke of her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients, despite the fact that she wore no decorations and carried no official recognition. Morrison closed the file and walked to his office window, looking out at the training grounds where his Marines were conducting marksmanship exercises. The sound of rifle fire echoed across the base, a familiar rhythm that usually brought him comfort. Today, it only reminded him of the questions he couldn't answer about the woman, who had somehow become central to his unit's success without ever officially becoming part of it. The intercom on his desk buzzed with his adjutant's voice. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Santos is here for her scheduled briefing." Morrison straightened his uniform and returned to his desk, adopting the stern expression that had served him well throughout his career. "Send her in." The woman who entered his office moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable with violence. Maria Santos was not physically imposing, perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall with a lean build that spoke of endurance rather than raw strength. But there was something in her dark eyes that made Morrison instinctively recognize her as dangerous. A predator whose calm exterior concealed capabilities that most people couldn't imagine. She wore standard Marine utility uniform without rank insignia, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow managed to look both professional and slightly rebellious. Her face was angular and weathered by sun and wind, marked by tiny scars that suggested close encounters with flying debris or shrapnel. But it was her hands that drew Morrison's attention, steady as stone, with calluses that spoke of countless hours gripping rifle stocks and adjusting scopes. "Staff Sergeant Santos reporting as ordered, sir," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Morrison couldn't quite place. Her posture was correct but not rigid, maintaining proper military bearing while somehow suggesting that she could move with lethal speed if circumstances required it. Morrison gestured to the chair across from his desk, studying her as she sat with the economical movements of someone who never wasted energy. "Staff Sergeant, I've been reviewing your service record, or what passes for one. I have to say, it raises more questions than it answers." Maria's expression remained neutral, but Morrison caught a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear or guilt, but the wariness of someone who had learned to be careful around authority figures. "What would you like to know, sir?" "Let's start with something simple," Morrison said, opening her file again. "According to these orders, you're assigned to provide precision fire support to my battalion, but you don't appear on any official roster. You receive pay through channels I can't identify, carry equipment that isn't standard issue, and report to superiors whose names are classified above my clearance level. How exactly am I supposed to manage a Marine I don't officially command?" Maria considered her response carefully, and Morrison found himself impressed despite his frustration. Lesser Marines would have either stammered through explanations or hidden behind the classified nature of their assignments. Santos simply met his gaze with steady confidence. "Sir, my assignment parameters are necessarily flexible due to the nature of my mission. I provide support to Marine units as needed, when conventional assets aren't available or appropriate." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "My orders authorize me to operate with considerable autonomy while remaining responsive to tactical commanders in the field." Morrison leaned back in his chair, recognizing the careful language of someone who had been coached on how to answer difficult questions without actually providing information. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you do whatever you want and expect me to deal with the consequences." For the first time, Maria's expression shifted slightly, and Morrison caught a glimpse of something harder beneath her professional demeanor. "Sir, I do whatever the mission requires. The consequences are something I deal with personally." There was something in her tone that made Morrison reconsider his approach. He had dealt with enough special operations personnel to recognize the signs of someone who had paid a significant personal price for their service. The classified nature of her assignment, the careful compartmentalization of information, the way she carried herself like someone who had operated alone in hostile territory for extended periods, it all suggested a background that involved more sacrifice than glory. "Staff Sergeant, help me understand something," Morrison said. adopting a more conversational tone. Your performance reports, what few I can access, indicate exceptional results. Enemy sniper activity has decreased dramatically in every area where you've operated. Marine casualties from precision fire have dropped to statistically insignificant levels. By any measurable standard, you're extraordinarily effective at your job. Maria waited, sensing that Morrison wasn't finished. But effectiveness without accountability creates problems for unit commanders, Morrison continued. When my Marines start talking about a guardian angel who appears and disappears without explanation, it affects morale, discipline, and operational security. When squad leaders file reports describing support from assets they can't identify through proper channels, it creates complications with higher command. Do you understand my position? Maria nodded slowly. You need to maintain order and structure within your command. My presence creates uncertainty that makes your job more difficult. Morrison was surprised by her directness. Exactly. So help me find a solution that works for both of us. Maria was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison found himself studying her face, trying to read the thoughts behind those dark eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was sharing something she rarely discussed. Sir, I understand your concerns about chain of command and proper procedures. I've operated within those structures for most of my career, and I recognize their importance. But my current assignment requires a different approach because conventional methods have proven inadequate for dealing with certain threats. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. The enemies I'm tasked with eliminating aren't conventional combatants. They're individuals with specialized training and equipment who have proven capable of inflicting significant casualties on our forces while remaining effectively invisible to standard counter-sniper operations. Hunting them requires someone who can operate outside normal tactical parameters. Morrison leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. What makes you different from other Marine snipers? Maria's smile was almost invisible, but Morrison caught it. I don't follow the same rules they do, sir. Which makes me effective against enemies who don't follow rules at all. Before Morrison could respond, his adjutant's voice came through the intercom with unusual urgency. Sir, we have an immediate priority message from Division. There's been an incident at Checkpoint Delta. Morrison activated his secure communication system, and the voice of Major General Patricia Hayes filled the office. Colonel Morrison, we have a situation developing at Checkpoint Delta. A Marine patrol was ambushed approximately 30 minutes ago by what appears to be a highly skilled sniper team. 2 Marines are confirmed Kia, 3 wounded, and the remaining squad members are pinned down in a kill zone with no available cover. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. Checkpoint Delta was in one of the most dangerous areas of their operational zone, a place where insurgent activity had been increasing despite their best efforts to establish security. General, what assets are available for immediate response? That's the problem, Colonel. The enemy positions are too well concealed for conventional support, and the terrain makes extraction extremely difficult. We need someone who can neutralize the sniper threat before we can safely extract the survivors. Morrison looked at Maria, who had remained perfectly still during the communication, but whose entire posture had shifted. The relaxed professionalism was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a predator sensing prey. General, Morrison said, making a decision that would change everything. I may have an asset available for immediate deployment. General Hayes. Voice sharpened with interest. What kind of asset? Morrison met Maria's gaze and saw her slight nod of acknowledgement. A specialist with extensive experience in counter-sniper operations. Unconventional methods, but proven effective against precisely this type of threat. How quickly can they deploy? Maria stood and moved toward the door with fluid efficiency. 15 minutes, sir, she said quietly, already mentally calculating distances, wind conditions, and approach routes. Colonel Morrison, General Hayes continued, I don't need to tell you how critical the situation is. Those Marines have been under continuous fire for over 30 minutes. Every minute we delay increases the chances of additional casualties. Morrison watched Maria pause at his office door, her hand on the handle. In that moment, he realized he was about to authorize an operation that existed in the gray areas between official policy and practical necessity. Everything about Maria Santos operated outside the normal structures he relied on. But the Marines trapped at Checkpoint Delta needed solutions that conventional approaches couldn't provide. General, the asset is moving to deploy immediately. I'll coordinate through normal channels and provide updates as the situation develops. Understood, Colonel. Make it happen. The communication ended, leaving Morrison alone with Maria in the sudden silence of his office. She waited by the door, and he could see that she was already shifting into whatever mental state allowed her to do the impossible things described in her classified reports. Staff Sergeant, Morrison said, I need to understand what I'm authorizing here. Can you neutralize this threat? Maria's expression had become something Morrison had never seen before, not cold or cruel, but utterly devoid of doubt or hesitation. It was the face of someone who had looked death in the eye so many times that it had become familiar territory. Sir, those Marines won't die on my watch, she said with quiet certainty. The enemy snipers will. Morrison nodded, making peace with the fact that he was about to send a woman with no official standing to solve a problem that was beyond the capabilities of his regular forces. What do you need? Nothing you can provide, sir. I have everything necessary for this mission. As Maria opened the door to leave, Morrison called after her. Staff Sergeant, how will I know when the situation is resolved? She turned back with that almost invisible smile. The shooting will stop, sir, and your Marines will come home. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Morrison alone with the uncomfortable realization that he had just authorized an operation he didn't fully understand, conducted by a Marine he didn't officially command, against enemies who had proven capable of killing his best-trained personnel. Outside his window, the sound of rifle fire from the training grounds continued its steady rhythm, but now it sounded different to Morrison. Where before it had represented the disciplined preparation of professional warriors, now it reminded him of the deadly reality facing the Marines trapped at Checkpoint Delta. He activated his secure communication system to coordinate support for whatever Maria was about to do, knowing that within the hour he would either be explaining a successful resolution to an impossible situation or justifying why he had sent an unaccountable asset into a tactical nightmare that had already claimed 2 Marine lives. Morrison pulled up tactical displays showing the terrain around Checkpoint Delta, studying the satellite imagery that revealed why conventional support had proven ineffective. The checkpoint sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided perfect concealment for enemy snipers. Multiple approach routes offered cover for infiltration, and the complex terrain made it nearly impossible to identify firing positions from the air. His operations staff had already attempted to coordinate helicopter gunship support, but the enemy snipers had demonstrated the kind of discipline and marksmanship that suggested professional military training. They had engaged the trapped Marines from concealed positions that couldn't be located through conventional reconnaissance, and their precision fire had prevented any attempt at movement or evacuation. Morrison reviewed the casualty reports with growing unease. Corporal James Mitchell and Lance Corporal Sarah Rodriguez had been killed instantly by precision headshots that suggested the enemy possessed both high-quality equipment and exceptional skill. The surviving Marines were trapped behind minimal cover, taking sporadic but accurate fire whenever they attempted to move. Medical evacuation was impossible as long as the sniper threat remained active. As Morrison studied the tactical situation, he found himself wondering what exactly he had unleashed in authorizing Maria's deployment. Her service record, what little he could access, contained references to operations that existed in the classified realm of special activities and unconventional warfare. She had been deployed to situations where normal military procedures had proven inadequate, sent to hunt enemies who operated outside the conventional rules of engagement. The more Morrison thought about it, the more he realized that Maria Santos represented something his structured military worldview had difficulty processing. She was effective precisely because she operated outside the systems that defined his understanding of proper command and control. Her success came from her ability to move and think like the enemy she hunted, using methods that regulations didn't cover because they couldn't be standardized or taught through normal training protocols. Morrison's adjutant knocked and entered with updated intelligence reports. Captain David Brooks was a capable officer who had served as Morrison's right hand for 8 months, but today he looked troubled by the developing situation. "Sir, intelligence reports indicate that the enemy force at Checkpoint Delta may be significantly larger than initially assessed. Communications intercepts suggest at least 3 separate sniper teams working in coordination, possibly with additional support elements." Morrison felt his concern deepen. 3 coordinated sniper teams represented a level of enemy capability that went far beyond opportunistic insurgent attacks. This was a planned operation conducted by professionals who understood advanced tactical concepts and possessed the equipment and training to execute complex ambushes. "Captain, what's our estimated timeline for conventional response options?" Brooks consulted his tablet, but his expression remained grim. "Sir, the terrain makes helicopter insertion extremely risky, and ground approach would take at least 2 hours through hostile territory. Even then, we'd be moving into a prepared kill zone against an enemy force that's demonstrated superior marksmanship and tactical discipline." Morrison realized that he had authorized Maria's deployment not just because conventional options were inadequate, but because they were essentially non-existent. The Marines trapped at Checkpoint Delta needed someone who could operate under conditions that rendered normal tactical doctrine useless. His secure phone rang with an update from the trapped Marines. Sergeant Tommy Williams, the senior survivor, reported their situation with the calm professionalism that made Morrison proud to command such warriors. "Colonel, we've identified at least 3 firing positions in the hills, north and east of our location. Enemy is demonstrating exceptional marksmanship and appears to have thermal optics. We've attempted movement twice and taken accurate fire both times. Request immediate support for extraction." Morrison could hear gunfire in the background, the sharp crack of precision rifles that confirmed the enemy's continued presence. "Sergeant Williams, support is en route. Maintain your position and stay behind cover. Help is coming." "Understood, sir." "We'll hold position, but ammunition is becoming a concern if this continues much longer." Morrison ended the communication and looked at his watch. 22 minutes had passed since Maria left his office. He had no way to contact her, no method of coordinating her approach, and no clear understanding of how she intended to resolve a situation that had stumped his best tactical minds. Captain Brooks remained in the office, clearly struggling with questions he was too professional to voice directly. "Sir, if I may ask, what exactly is the nature of the support asset you've deployed?" Morrison considered how to answer without revealing information he wasn't authorized to share. "Captain, sometimes unconventional problems require unconventional solutions. The asset in question has experience with precisely this type of threat." Brooks nodded, but Morrison could see that his adjutant was concerned about operating outside normal command structures. It was exactly the kind of concern that Morrison himself had felt before authorizing Maria's deployment, the institutional discomfort that came from relying on capabilities that existed outside established procedures. Morrison's communication system crackled with a priority transmission from division headquarters. General Hayes' voice carried the tension of a commander dealing with a deteriorating tactical situation. "Colonel Morrison, we're monitoring communications from Checkpoint Delta. The situation appears to be worsening, and we're getting pressure from higher command for immediate resolution. What's the status of your unconventional asset? Morrison realized he was about to provide a status update on an operation he couldn't monitor through normal channels. General, the asset deployed approximately 25 minutes ago. Based on previous performance, I expect resolution within the next 15 to 30 minutes. Colonel, I need to understand what we're dealing with here. Division is asking questions about operational parameters and command authority that I can't answer without more information. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending an operation he didn't fully understand. General, the asset operates under special authorization with proven effectiveness against this type of threat. The operational details are classified above my clearance level, but the results speak for themselves. There was a pause before General Hayes responded, and Morrison could imagine the conversation happening at division headquarters as senior officers tried to make sense of a situation that defied normal operational categories. Colonel, I'm going to trust your judgment on this, but I need results. Those Marines have been under fire for almost an hour, and every minute increases the political and operational costs of this incident. Understood, General. I'm confident. The situation will be resolved shortly. Morrison ended the communication and realized that his confidence was based entirely on faith rather than tactical analysis. He was trusting a woman he barely knew to accomplish something his regular forces couldn't achieve, using methods he didn't understand against enemies who had proven themselves capable of outmatching conventional military responses. Captain Brooks cleared his throat diplomatically. Sir, would it be helpful to deploy additional surveillance assets to monitor the situation? Morrison considered the suggestion, but realized that conventional surveillance might actually compromise whatever Maria was attempting to accomplish. Her effectiveness seemed to depend on operating outside normal detection parameters, moving through hostile territory in ways that avoided both enemy observation and friendly force interference. Negative, Captain. We maintain current positions and wait for resolution. Brooks nodded, but Morrison could see his adjutant's discomfort with the passive role they were playing in a developing crisis. It went against every instinct of professional military officers to authorize action without maintaining positive control over the operation. Morrison walked to his window again, looking out at the training grounds where Marines continued their preparation for combat. The irony wasn't lost on him that while his best-trained warriors practiced conventional tactics in controlled environments, the most dangerous mission of the day was being conducted by someone who operated entirely outside those training parameters. His secure phone rang again with an update from Checkpoint Delta. Sergeant Williams' voice carried increased urgency. Colonel, enemy fire has intensified. They appear to be maneuvering for better positions, possibly preparing for a coordinated assault on our location. We can hold our current position, but we need immediate support if they decide to advance. Morrison felt the weight of command, responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The Marines trapped at Checkpoint Delta were his responsibility, warriors who had trusted him to provide them with the support necessary to survive and complete their mission. He had authorized an unconventional response based on classified capabilities he didn't fully understand, and now their lives hung in the balance of that decision. Sergeant Williams, maintain your position. Support is active in your area, and resolution is imminent. Copy that, sir. We're ready for whatever comes next. Morrison ended the call and checked his watch again. 35 minutes had passed since Maria's deployment. The silence from her operation was absolute. No communications, no status updates, no indication that she was even in the area. For all Morrison knew, she could have encountered her own difficulties or decided that the tactical situation was beyond even her capabilities. Captain Brooks remained at attention, waiting for orders but clearly struggling with the unusual nature of their tactical situation. Morrison realized that his adjutant's discomfort reflected broader institutional concerns about accountability and proper command authority that would eventually require explanation to higher headquarters. "Captain," Morrison said, making another decision that would have long-term consequences, "prepare a preliminary after-action report template. Classification level will be determined based on operational results, but assume it will require special handling procedures." Brooks nodded with visible relief at receiving concrete tasking. "Yes, sir." "Should I coordinate with intelligence for operational details?" Morrison considered the question, realizing that the operational details might well remain classified beyond his unit's ability to document them. "Coordinate for standard tactical information, but understand that some operational specifics may not be available through normal channels." As Brooks left to begin report preparation, Morrison found himself alone with thoughts that challenged his fundamental understanding of military command and control. Maria Santos represented capabilities that existed outside the structured systems he had relied on throughout his career, operating with authorities that bypassed normal accountability measures. Yet the Marines trapped at Checkpoint Delta needed exactly those capabilities to survive a tactical situation that conventional approaches couldn't resolve. Morrison was learning that effective command sometimes required accepting solutions that didn't fit within established frameworks, trusting in capabilities that couldn't be easily explained or replicated. His communication system remained silent, providing no updates from the developing operation. The only sounds in his office were the distant echoes of training exercises and the quiet hum of electronic equipment, monitoring communications channels that carried no traffic from the woman who held the key to resolving an impossible tactical situation. Morrison realized that within the next few minutes, he would either be vindicated in his decision to trust an unconventional asset or forced to explain why he had authorized an operation that cost additional Marine lives. The weight of that responsibility was something no amount of training had prepared him to carry, but it was the burden of command in a world where conventional solutions didn't always match unconventional threats. Maria Santos moved through the rocky terrain like water flowing around obstacles, her body instinctively finding the paths of least resistance while her mind calculated angles, distances, and wind patterns with the precision of a computer. Weight of her rifle felt familiar across her shoulders, a companion that had shared more dangerous moments than any living person in her life. She had been moving for 43 minutes since leaving Morrison's office, covering ground that would have taken a conventional patrol hours to traverse. Her approach to Checkpoint Delta followed routes that existed only in the spaces between enemy observation points, using terrain features and natural concealment that most people would never notice. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated, to avoid detection by both friendly forces and the enemy snipers who had already demonstrated their lethal capabilities. Through her scope, Maria could see the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. 3 separate sniper teams had positioned themselves in an overlapping pattern that created an inescapable kill zone around the trapped Marines. The enemy had chosen their positions with professional competence, utilizing natural rock formations and sparse vegetation to create concealment that would be nearly impossible to detect from conventional observation points. The first team occupied a position approximately 800 meters north of the checkpoint, concealed among a cluster of boulders that provided both cover and an excellent field of fire. The second team had established themselves on a ridgeline to the east, using a shallow depression behind a rocky outcropping that made them invisible from ground level while allowing clear shots at the Marine position. The third team, the most dangerous, had worked their way to within 400 meters on the southwest approach, close enough to deliver precision fire with devastating accuracy. Maria studied each position through her spotting scope, noting equipment configurations and movement, patterns that told her everything she needed to know about her enemies. These weren't insurgents with improvised weapons and minimal training. The disciplined fire control, coordinated positioning, and professional equipment suggested foreign military advisors or mercenaries with advanced tactical education. She could see the thermal signatures of her targets through her specialized optics, watching their breathing patterns and noting the mechanical precision with which they maintained their firing positions. One sniper in the eastern position was left-handed, favoring his strong side in ways that would affect his reaction time to threats from specific directions. The team leader in the northern position kept checking his watch, suggesting they were operating under time constraints that might create opportunities for exploitation. Most importantly, Maria observed their psychological state through subtle behavioral indicators that years of hunting human predators had taught her to recognize. They were confident but not overconfident, disciplined but beginning to show signs of fatigue from maintaining heightened alertness for extended periods. They had achieved tactical surprise and inflicted casualties, but now they were committed to positions that limited their own mobility while waiting for whatever larger plan they were supporting. Maria began her approach to the northern position, moving through a natural depression that would bring her to within 200 meters of the enemy without exposing her to observation from the other teams. Her movement was so careful that she disturbed nothing larger than individual pebbles, creating no visual or auditory signature that might alert her targets to her presence. As she moved, Maria's mind shifted into the mental state that made her exceptional at this work. Emotions became irrelevant, personal concerns disappeared, and her entire existence focused down to the mathematical relationships between wind speed, bullet trajectory, and target vulnerability. She became a calculating machine designed for one purpose: eliminating threats to American Marines with surgical precision. The trapped Marines continued to take sporadic fire from all three enemy positions, but Maria could tell from the reduced rate of fire that the enemy snipers were conserving ammunition while maintaining psychological pressure. They were professionals who understood that killing every Marine immediately was less valuable than keeping them pinned down while some larger operation developed elsewhere. Maria reached her firing position and began the methodical process of range estimation and environmental calculation that preceded any precision shot. Wind speed at ground level was negligible, but she could see vegetation movement that indicated stronger currents at higher elevations. Temperature variations between the shaded areas, where she lay, and the sun-exposed positions of her targets would affect bullet trajectory in subtle but measurable ways. She chambered around with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed, settling into a prone position that distributed her weight across multiple contact points for maximum stability. Her breathing slowed to the deep, controlled rhythm that would allow her to fire between heartbeats, eliminating even the minor movement caused by her pulse. Through her scope, the northern sniper team came into sharp focus. Two men, both wearing equipment that confirmed Maria's assessment of their professional status. The primary shooter was a tall, lean individual with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to killing at distance. His spotter was younger, possibly less experienced, but his equipment handling suggested thorough training in advanced observation techniques. Maria adjusted her scope for the 800-meter shot, compensating for the slight upward angle and calculating the ballistic trajectory that would place her bullet precisely where it needed to be. Her finger found the trigger with the familiarity of a pianist touching keys, applying the exact pressure necessary to prepare for the shot without disturbing her sight picture. The primary shooter moved his head slightly to adjust his scope, and Maria saw her opportunity. In the fraction of a second when his attention was focused entirely on his own target, she fired with the kind of precision that made the impossible seem routine. The bullet struck him in the center of his forehead with an impact that dropped him instantly, his body collapsing behind his rifle without sound or struggle. His spotter turned toward the sound, confusion evident in his movements as he tried to understand what had happened to his partner. Maria was already working the bolt of her rifle, chambering a second round while shifting her aim point to account for the spotter's new position. The second shot came 3 seconds after the first, catching the spotter as he raised his head above the rocky cover to scan for threats. The bullet struck him in the throat, ending his life before he could identify Maria's position or alert the other teams. 2 down, 4 to go. Maria immediately began moving toward her next firing position, knowing that the enemy's tactical discipline would eventually lead them to investigate the silence from the northern team. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the remaining snipers realized their colleagues were dead and began searching for the threat that had eliminated them. The eastern position required a different approach. The ridgeline provided excellent concealment for the enemy team, but also limited their escape routes once they came under fire. Maria circled wide to the south, using the dry creek bed that would allow her to approach from an angle that placed the morning sun behind her position. As she moved, Maria monitored the radio communications from the trapped Marines, listening to Sergeant Williams coordinate his team's defensive positions while medical personnel worked on the wounded. The professionalism in their voices made her move faster, knowing that every minute of delay increased the psychological toll on warriors who were depending on support they couldn't see or understand. The Eastern team occupied a position that demonstrated sophisticated tactical planning. They had carved a shallow fighting position behind a natural rock formation, creating a hide that was invisible from most approach angles while providing clear fields of fire toward the checkpoint. Their equipment was spread around the position in a pattern that suggested they planned to occupy it for extended periods. Maria studied their position for several minutes, noting that both shooters were focused entirely on the trapped Marines and showed no awareness of threats from other directions. Their confidence in their concealment had made them complacent about security, a mistake that Maria intended to exploit with ruthless efficiency. She established her firing position 400 meters south of their location, using a shallow depression behind a cluster of desert shrubs that provided both concealment and a stable shooting platform. The range was closer than she preferred for this type of operation, but the terrain offered no better alternatives that would maintain her tactical advantage. Through her scope, Maria could see both enemy snipers clearly. The primary shooter was an older man with graying hair and the steady movements of someone with extensive combat experience. His spotter appeared younger, but moved with the same professional competence, suggesting they were part of an established team rather than hastily assembled individuals. Maria calculated her shots carefully, knowing that she would need to eliminate both targets in rapid succession to prevent either one from alerting the remaining team to her presence. The angle of their position meant that her first shot would be partially obscured by the rock formation, requiring precise placement to ensure an immediate kill. She settled into her shooting position and controlled her breathing, waiting for the perfect moment when both targets would be positioned for optimal engagement. The primary shooter adjusted his scope, leaning slightly forward in a way that exposed his profile while his spotter consulted a range card. Maria fired twice in succession, working her bolt with mechanical precision between shots. The first bullet struck the primary shooter in the temple, killing him instantly and causing him to collapse across his rifle. The second shot caught the spotter as he turned toward his fallen partner, the bullet entering his chest and destroying vital organs before he could react to the threat. 4 down, 2 to go. The southwestern team posed the greatest challenge. Their proximity to the trapped Marines meant that any gunfire in their direction risked hitting friendly forces, and their position offered multiple escape routes that would allow them to relocate if they detected her presence. Maria would need to approach within close range and eliminate both targets with absolute precision. She began moving immediately, knowing that the remaining enemy team would eventually notice the silence from their colleagues and begin investigating. Professional snipers maintained regular communication schedules, and the absence of scheduled Check-ins would alert them to the possibility that they were being hunted. Maria's approach to the southwestern position took her through terrain that offered minimal concealment, forcing her to move with exaggerated care to avoid detection. She used every shadow, every slight depression in the ground, every piece of vegetation that might break up her silhouette against the surrounding landscape. The enemy team had positioned themselves behind a low ridge that provided excellent cover from the checkpoint, but limited their observation of approaches from other directions. Maria could see the muzzle of their rifle protruding slightly beyond the edge of their concealment, indicating their continued focus on the trapped Marines. She worked her way to within 150 meters of their position, close enough to hear their whispered communications as they coordinated their fire. They were speaking in a language Maria didn't recognize, but their tone and body language suggested growing concern about the silence from their supporting teams. Maria established her final firing position behind a cluster of rocks that provided minimal concealment, but offered a clear line of sight to the enemy position. At this range, she could see individual details of their equipment and observe their facial expressions through her scope. The primary shooter was a heavily built man, with dark hair and the kind of patient intensity that marked him as extremely dangerous. His spotter was smaller and more nervous, frequently checking his watch and scanning the surrounding terrain with increasing anxiety. They were beginning to suspect that something had gone wrong with their operation. Maria watched them through her scope, waiting for the moment when both targets would be optimally positioned for simultaneous engagement. The range was short enough that she could fire rapidly without significant adjustment between shots, but the proximity to friendly forces required absolute precision. The enemy spotter raised his head above their concealment to scan the area, where his northern colleague should have been visible, exposing himself completely while his partner remained focused on the Marines below. Maria fired immediately, the bullet striking the spotter in the center of his face and dropping him behind their defensive position. The primary shooter reacted instantly, rolling away from his rifle and reaching for a sidearm while scanning for threats. Maria tracked his movement through her scope and fired again, the second bullet catching him as he attempted to rise from cover. He collapsed beside his partner, ending the immediate threat to the trapped Marines. 6 down. Threat eliminated. Maria remained in position for several minutes, scanning the surrounding terrain through her scope to ensure no additional enemy forces were present. The silence that followed her last shot was profound, broken only by the distant sound of wind. Through rock formations and the faint voices of Marines coordinating their movement below, she activated her encrypted radio for the first time since beginning her approach, transmitting a brief message on the frequency monitored by Morrison's command post. Bravo 6, this is Sierra 1, threat neutralized. Area secure for extraction. Maria began her withdrawal immediately, knowing that the arrival of extraction forces would bring increased activity to the area that might compromise her own security. She moved away from the engagement zone using a different route than her approach, following terrain that would take her back toward friendly lines without crossing paths with the incoming support elements. As she moved, Maria felt the familiar emptiness that always followed successful completion of her missions. The intense focus required for precision elimination of human targets left her mentally and physically drained, but also strangely hollow. She had eliminated 6 enemies who posed immediate threats to American Marines, but the satisfaction of mission accomplishment was always tempered by the knowledge that other threats would emerge elsewhere. Her radio crackled with transmissions. As Morrison's forces coordinated the extraction of the trapped Marines and the recovery of enemy bodies for intelligence analysis, she could hear the relief in their voices as they confirmed that the sniper threat had been eliminated and that they could safely move through areas that had been death traps only minutes earlier. Maria reached a predetermined extraction point where a nondescript civilian vehicle waited with an equally nondescript driver who asked no questions about her mission or the rifle case she placed in the trunk. The driver was part of the logistical network that supported her operations, one of many people who facilitated her work without requiring explanations or official acknowledgement. As the vehicle carried her away from the operational area, Maria watched the landscape pass by with the detached observation of someone who had spent years moving through hostile territory. She had accomplished her mission with the kind of precision that would generate classified reports and quiet commendations, but no public recognition or official acknowledgement. Morrison would receive confirmation that the threat had been eliminated and his Marines successfully extracted, but the details of how that had been accomplished would remain compartmentalized within classified channels that protected both operational methods and personnel identities. Maria Santos would continue to exist in the gray areas between official military structures and practical necessities. Her encrypted phone vibrated with a message from handlers she had never met, containing coordinates for her next assignment, and a timeline that suggested the war against unconventional enemies would continue without pause. There were always more threats that required her particular combination of skills and moral flexibility. Always more situations where conventional military responses proved inadequate. Maria closed her eyes and allowed the rhythm of the vehicle to carry her toward whatever came next, knowing that somewhere behind her, Marines were going home alive because she had chosen to operate outside the rules that governed everyone else's. War. It was a choice that brought no medals or public recognition, but it was the only choice she could live with. The vehicle disappeared into the traffic of the nearby city, carrying a woman whose existence was known only to those who needed her services and whose effectiveness was measured in lives saved rather than regulations followed. Maria Santos had once again demonstrated that some battles could only be won by warriors willing to fight them alone, in the shadows where official policies couldn't reach. Morrison received confirmation of successful mission completion. Encrypted channels, but he would never know the details of how 6 enemy snipers had been eliminated with surgical precision by a single operator. The after-action reports would reference specialized assets and unconventional capabilities, without explaining what those terms actually meant in practice. The Marines who had been trapped at Checkpoint Delta would return to base with stories about gunfire that seemed to come from nowhere and enemies who simply stopped shooting without explanation. They would speculate about guardian angels and mysterious support, but they would never know that their lives had been saved by a woman who moved through enemy territory like smoke through ruins. Maria Santos had disappeared back into the classified world where her kind of warfare was conducted, leaving behind only silence and the scattered remains of threats that would never again endanger American forces. She was already thinking about her next mission, calculating new ranges and angles, preparing for the next time that conventional solutions would prove inadequate and someone like her would be needed to tip the balance. The legend would grow in the retelling, spreading through mess halls and barracks as Marines shared stories about the guardian angel who appeared when situations seemed hopeless. But Maria herself would remain invisible, a ghost who fought ghosts in a war that officially didn't exist but never really ended. The silence in Morrison's office felt heavier than the desert air outside Camp Lejeune. 3 hours had passed since the successful extraction of the Marines from Checkpoint Delta, and the after-action reports painted a picture that challenged everything Morrison thought he understood about modern warfare. 6 enemy snipers eliminated by a single operator using methods that left no witnesses and minimal physical evidence. The Marine survivors spoke in hushed tones about gunfire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, about enemy positions that simply went silent without warning or explanation. Sergeant Williams had attempted to provide tactical details for the official report, but his account read more like folklore than military documentation. Morrison studied the classified summary that had arrived through encrypted channels, noting the clinical language that described tactical outcomes without explaining operational methods. Maria Santos had accomplished something that conventional forces couldn't achieve. But the documentation of her success existed in the gray areas between official policy and practical necessity. Captain Brooks entered with additional intelligence reports, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with underlying concern. "Sir, forensic analysis of the enemy positions confirms elimination of all hostile forces. No survivors, no evidence of extraction attempts. The enemy snipers were killed in place with precision that suggests exceptional marksmanship capabilities." Morrison looked up from the classified summary. "What about the weapons and equipment recovered from the enemy positions?" Brooks consulted his tablet, reviewing information that painted an increasingly complex picture of the threat they had faced. Advanced sniper systems, thermal optics, encrypted communications equipment. The enemy forces were equipped with military-grade hardware that indicates significant financial backing and professional training. These weren't local insurgents. The implications hung in the air between them. Someone with substantial resources had deployed a professional sniper team against American forces, using equipment and tactics that suggested foreign military involvement. The successful elimination of that threat had prevented what could have escalated into a significant international incident. Morrison's secure phone rang with a call from division headquarters. General Hayes' voice carried the satisfaction of a commander whose tactical problems had been resolved through decisive action. "Colonel Morrison, I've reviewed the preliminary reports from Checkpoint Delta. Outstanding results from your unconventional asset. Division Command is impressed with the speed and effectiveness of the resolution." Morrison felt the familiar uncertainty that came with accepting credit for operations he hadn't directly controlled. "General, the asset performed exactly as expected. The threat was neutralized with minimal risk to our personnel. Colonel, I need to understand the operational parameters for future planning purposes. What are the limitations and availability of this capability?" Morrison realized he was being asked to define something he didn't fully understand himself. Maria Santos operated under authorities that bypassed his command structure, using resources and methods that existed outside normal military doctrine. Her availability depended on factors beyond his knowledge or control. "General, the asset operates under special authorization with mission parameters that vary based on threat assessment. Availability is determined through classified channels above my clearance level." General Hayes was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of Morrison's response. "Colonel, Division wants to ensure we can access this capability when similar situations arise. Can you provide guidance on proper coordination procedures?" Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining coordination procedures for capabilities he couldn't officially acknowledge. "General, my understanding is that the asset responds to verified threats that exceed conventional response capabilities. Coordination occurs through existing intelligence channels when operational requirements match available specialties." "Understood, Colonel. Draft a preliminary assessment of operational effectiveness for division review. Classification level to be determined based on content sensitivity." Morrison ended the call and realized he was being asked to document something that might not be documentable through normal military reporting procedures. Maria's effectiveness was undeniable, but the methods and authorities that enabled her success existed in classified realms that complicated traditional accountability measures. Brooks remained in the office, clearly waiting for guidance on how to process information that didn't fit normal reporting categories. "Sir, how should we handle the discrepancies between witness accounts and physical evidence?" Morrison considered the question, recognizing that the discrepancies Brooks mentioned reflected the unique nature of Maria's operational methods. The Marines who had been trapped at Checkpoint Delta described events they couldn't fully explain, while the physical evidence suggested capabilities that exceeded standard military training. "Captain, focus the reports on tactical outcomes and verified facts." Operational details that can't be confirmed through multiple sources should be noted as preliminary pending further investigation. Brooks nodded, but Morrison could see his adjutant's continued discomfort with the ambiguous nature of their situation. Professional military officers were trained to document and explain operational activities through established procedures, but Maria's missions generated results that resisted conventional explanation. Morrison's thoughts were interrupted by his adjutant announcing an unexpected visitor. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Santos is here requesting a few minutes of your time." Morrison felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. He had been wondering how to debrief an operation he hadn't officially authorized, conducted by someone who operated outside his normal command authority. "Send her in." Maria entered his office with the same fluid grace he remembered, but something in her demeanor had changed. The intense focus that had marked their previous encounter was gone, replaced by a kind of quiet weariness that suggested the psychological toll of her work. She wore clean utilities and appeared physically unharmed, but Morrison noticed subtle signs of fatigue around her eyes. "Staff Sergeant Santos reporting, sir. Mission accomplished. All objectives achieved." Morrison gestured for her to sit, studying her face for clues about what she had experienced during the operation. "Staff Sergeant, I've received preliminary reports indicating successful resolution of the tactical situation. Can you provide additional details for the official record?" Maria's expression became carefully neutral, and Morrison recognized the same careful consideration of words he had seen during their previous conversation. "Sir, enemy forces were engaged and neutralized according to mission parameters. No American casualties resulted from the intervention, and the area was secured for extraction operations." Morrison realized she was providing him with exactly the kind of factual summary that could be included in official reports without revealing operational details that might compromise future missions. "Staff Sergeant, the Marines you supported speak very highly of the professionalism demonstrated during the operation." For the first time, Maria's expression softened slightly. Those Marines performed with exceptional courage under extremely difficult circumstances. It was an honor to support their mission. Morrison found himself impressed by her deflection of credit toward the Marines she had supported, recognizing the genuine respect she felt for the warriors whose lives she had saved. But he also sensed that she was preparing to leave, returning to whatever classified realm supported her operations. "Staff Sergeant, I need to ask about future coordination procedures. Division Command is interested in understanding how to access similar capabilities when comparable situations arise." Maria considered her response carefully, and Morrison could see her weighing the requirements of operational security against the practical needs of tactical commanders. "Sir, threat assessments are conducted continuously through intelligence channels. When situations exceed conventional response capabilities, appropriate assets are deployed through existing authorization procedures." Morrison recognized another diplomatically worded non-answer that provided general information without revealing specific details about command structures or operational methods. But he also understood that Maria was operating under constraints that prevented her from sharing information he wasn't authorized to receive. "Staff Sergeant, speaking personally rather than officially, I want you to know that your actions today saved the lives of Marines under my command. That matters more than any procedural concerns or documentation requirements." Maria met his gaze directly, and Morrison saw a flicker of something genuine behind her professional demeanor. "Sir, those Marines would have saved themselves eventually. They're warriors who never give up. I just provided some tactical assistance to speed up the process." Morrison realized she was being modest about accomplishments that bordered on the supernatural, deflecting recognition for capabilities that most people couldn't imagine. But he also understood that her effectiveness depended partly on maintaining the kind of anonymity that made official recognition impossible. His secure phone rang with another call from division headquarters. This time from the intelligence section, requesting preliminary threat assessment data for regional security planning. Morrison answered while gesturing for Maria to remain seated. Colonel Morrison, we're receiving indicators that the Checkpoint Delta incident may be connected to broader enemy activities in the region. The equipment and tactics employed suggest a level of coordination that exceeds local insurgent capabilities. Morrison looked at Maria, who remained perfectly still, but whose attention had sharpened at the mention of broader enemy activities. What kind of coordination are we discussing? Multiple incidents across the theater involving similar equipment and tactical approaches. Someone with significant resources is deploying professional assets against American forces. We need to understand the full scope of this threat. Morrison realized that Maria's mission had uncovered evidence of a larger enemy operation that posed ongoing threats to American personnel throughout the region. The successful elimination of the sniper team had provided intelligence about capabilities and methods that suggested foreign military involvement. What's the timeline for threat assessment completion? 48 hours for preliminary analysis, but we need immediate security enhancements for all forward positions until we understand the full scope of enemy capabilities. Morrison ended the call and turned back to Maria, who had listened to the conversation with the kind of focused attention that suggested professional interest in the developing intelligence picture. Staff Sergeant, does this information about broader enemy activities change anything about operational assessments or response requirements? Maria was quiet for a moment, and Morrison could see her considering information that he wasn't authorized to know. Sir, threat patterns are continuously evaluated through appropriate channels. Asset deployment decisions are based on comprehensive intelligence analysis that includes both tactical and strategic considerations. Morrison understood that she was telling him that decisions about her future missions were made at levels far above his command authority, based on intelligence assessments that painted a more complete picture than he was able to access. But he also sensed that the conversation about broader enemy activities had triggered something in her professional awareness. Staff Sergeant, I won't ask about classified operational details, but I want to ensure that my command can provide appropriate support for any future activities in our area of responsibility. Maria stood, and Morrison realized their conversation was ending. Sir, your command's professional competence and commitment to mission accomplishment provides the best possible support for all operations in this area. The Marines under your leadership are exceptional warriors who deserve every available resource. As she moved toward the door, Morrison called after her. Staff Sergeant, will I see you again, or do you disappear back into whatever classified realm you came from? Maria paused at the door, and for a moment Morrison thought he saw something almost like regret in her expression. Sir, warriors like us serve wherever the mission requires. Sometimes that means staying visible, sometimes it means becoming invisible. Either way, the mission continues. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, but Morrison had one final question. Staff Sergeant, in your professional opinion, how should conventional commanders handle situations that require unconventional solutions? Maria turned back with a slight smile that transformed her entire face. Sir, trust your instincts, support your Marines, and remember that sometimes the most important victories happen in the spaces between the rules. The door closed behind her with the same soft click Morrison remembered from their first encounter, leaving him alone with reports that documented impossible accomplishments and questions that had no conventional answers. Outside his window, the sounds of normal military activity continued. But Morrison knew he had been changed by his encounter with capabilities that existed beyond normal understanding. Captain Brooks returned with completed preliminary reports, his expression suggesting continued struggle with documentation requirements for operations that defied conventional explanation. Sir, the reports are ready for your review, but several sections require classification determinations above our authority level. Morrison accepted the reports, knowing they would provide official documentation for an operation that had saved Marine lives through methods that couldn't be fully explained or replicated. Captain, classify the reports at the highest level. Our authority allows and forward them through intelligence channels for appropriate handling. Brooks nodded, but Morrison could see his adjutant's continued concern about accountability and proper documentation procedures. Sir, how do we handle follow-up coordination if similar situations arise? Morrison considered the question, realizing that Brooks was asking how to coordinate with capabilities that operated outside normal command structures. Captain, we maintain our normal operational readiness and trust that appropriate assets will be deployed when circumstances require them. It wasn't a satisfying answer from a procedural standpoint, but Morrison understood that some capabilities couldn't be summoned through normal channels or controlled through conventional command. Authority. Maria Santos and others like her responded to threats that exceeded standard military responses, using methods that existed in the classified spaces between official policy and practical necessity. Morrison's secure communication system activated with an encrypted message from regional command containing information that painted a more complete picture of the threat environment his forces were operating in. Intelligence assessments indicated that the Checkpoint Delta incident was indeed part of a broader enemy campaign involving foreign military advisors and advanced equipment. The successful elimination of the enemy sniper team had disrupted a planned series of attacks against American forces, providing breathing space for enhanced security measures and counterintelligence operations. Maria's mission had accomplished more than saving the lives of trapped Marines. It had prevented escalation of hostile activities that could have resulted in significant casualties across the theater. Morrison realized that he had witnessed something exceptional, not just in terms of individual capability, but in terms of the broader systems that enabled such operations. Somewhere in the classified realm beyond his authority, decision-makers evaluated threats and deployed assets with surgical precision, using capabilities that conventional military structures couldn't provide. 3 weeks later, Morrison received notification that he was being considered for promotion to full colonel, with assignment to a staff position that would involve coordination between conventional forces and special operations elements. The notification mentioned his demonstrated ability to integrate unconventional assets with standard military operations, suggesting that his experience with Maria Santos had been observed and evaluated by higher authority. Morrison understood that his willingness to trust capabilities he didn't fully understand had marked him as someone who could operate effectively in the gray areas where conventional military doctrine met practical necessity. It was recognition of a different kind, acknowledgement that effective command sometimes required accepting solutions that existed outside established frameworks. The Marines who had been trapped at Checkpoint Delta returned to normal operations, with stories that became part of unit folklore. They spoke of guardian angels and mysterious support with the kind of reverence that soldiers reserved for those who had saved their lives under impossible circumstances. But they also demonstrated a new confidence in facing dangerous situations, knowing that help might come from unexpected directions when conventional options proved inadequate. Morrison never saw Maria Santos again, but he occasionally received intelligence summaries that referenced successful operations conducted by specialized assets in other areas of the theater. The clinical language of those reports couldn't convey the human reality of lives saved and threats eliminated, but Morrison understood what they represented in practical terms. Somewhere in the classified world beyond his authority, Maria Santos continued her eternal patrol, moving through hostile territory like smoke through ruins, eliminating threats that conventional forces couldn't engage. She remained invisible to official recognition, her existence known only to those who needed her services and whose effectiveness was measured in lives saved rather than regulations followed. The legend continued to grow in the retelling, spreading through bases and forward positions as Marines shared stories about the silent sniper who appeared when situations seemed hopeless. But Maria herself remained a ghost who fought ghosts in a war that officially didn't exist, but never really ended, serving in the spaces between the rules where the most important battles were fought and won. Morrison kept her final words close to his memory, understanding that they represented wisdom earned through experiences he could barely imagine. Sometimes the most important victories happened in the spaces between the rules, achieved by warriors willing to operate outside conventional frameworks for the sake of those who couldn't protect themselves. In the end, Maria Santos had taught him that effective leadership sometimes meant accepting mysteries that couldn't be solved, trusting capabilities that couldn't be controlled, and finding peace with the knowledge that some battles could only be won by those who chose honor over hierarchy, mission over procedure, and conscience over career. The desert winds continued to sweep across Camp Leoin, carrying with them the sounds of training exercises and routine operations. But Morrison knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, other threats were being engaged by warriors whose names would never appear in official records, whose victories would never be publicly acknowledged, and whose sacrifice ensured that the warriors under his command could sleep safely in their bunks. Maria Santos had become legend, but legends were built on truth that was too important to be limited by conventional understanding. The Pentagon's corridors buzzed with the controlled urgency that marked significant developments and ongoing operations. General Patricia Hayes walked through the labyrinthine hallways toward a briefing room that officially didn't exist, carrying a folder containing intelligence assessments that painted an increasingly complex picture of enemy activities across multiple theaters of operation. The intelligence community had spent 6 months analyzing patterns that connected dozens of incidents involving foreign military advisors, advanced equipment, and tactical approaches that exceeded conventional insurgent capabilities. The successful elimination of the sniper team at Checkpoint Delta had provided the breakthrough that allowed analysts to identify a coordinated campaign targeting American forces worldwide. Hayes entered the secure briefing room where representatives from multiple agencies waited with expressions that suggested the gravity of their discoveries. The assembled group included personnel from military intelligence, the CIA, and other organizations whose involvement indicated the scope of the threat they were addressing. Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Defense Intelligence Agency opened the briefing with satellite imagery that showed training facilities in 3 different countries, all displaying identical tactical setups for advanced sniper instruction. The enemy forces eliminated at Checkpoint Delta were part of a systematic program to deploy foreign military specialists against American personnel. We've identified at least 12 similar incidents across 4 theaters of operation. Hayes studied the imagery, recognizing the professional competence that had created training facilities capable of producing the kind of enemies that conventional forces struggled to counter. What's the assessment of their operational objectives? Psychological warfare combined with tactical disruption, Mitchell replied, advancing to the next slide that showed casualty statistics and mission impact assessments. They're targeting American forces with precision strikes designed to erode confidence in our ability to operate safely in contested areas. The goal appears to be forcing us to adopt defensive postures that limit our strategic effectiveness. General Hayes felt the implications settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Someone with substantial resources had developed a comprehensive strategy for degrading American military capabilities through the systematic deployment of precision threats that conventional responses couldn't adequately address. What assets do we have available to counter this type of threat? The question hung in the air for a moment before CIA Representative David Chun opened a different folder containing information that carried classification markings Hayes recognized, but couldn't access through normal channels. We have specialized capabilities designed specifically for this type of asymmetric threat. Small numbers of highly trained operatives who can engage enemy specialists using similar methods and equipment. Hayes understood that Chen was describing programs that existed in the classified spaces between official military structure and practical necessity. What are the operational parameters for deploying these capabilities? Flexible response-based. On threat assessment and tactical requirements, Chung replied with the careful language that characterized discussions of sensitive operations. Assets are deployed when conventional responses prove inadequate, and when the strategic value of mission success justifies exceptional operational authorities. Hayes realized she was learning about capabilities that had been operating while she focused on conventional military responses to unconventional threats. The successful resolution of the Checkpoint Delta incident had been accomplished by systems she hadn't known existed, using methods that challenged her understanding of military operations. Mitchell advanced to intelligence assessments that showed the broader scope of enemy activities. The foreign specialists eliminated at Checkpoint Delta were carrying equipment and documents that revealed planned operations against 17 different American installations. Their elimination disrupted a coordinated campaign that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties. The weight of that revelation transformed Hayes' understanding of what had occurred during Morrison's authorization of unconventional support. What she had viewed as a tactical solution to a localized problem had actually prevented a strategic disaster that could have affected American operations worldwide. Chun consulted his secure tablet before sharing additional information that painted an even more complex picture. Intelligence gathered from the eliminated enemy forces led to the identification and disruption of 3 additional specialist teams operating in different regions. Secondary operations eliminated those threats before they could execute planned attacks. Hayes felt a chill of recognition as she understood the implications. The specialized assets Chun described had used intelligence from the Checkpoint Delta operation to conduct additional missions that prevented attacks against American forces she commanded. Her own troops had been protected by operations she never knew were occurring. How many of these specialized assets are available for deployment? Chun's expression became carefully neutral. Numbers are classified, but capabilities exist to address identified threats within acceptable operational timeframes. Asset availability is determined through continuous threat assessment and strategic priority evaluation. Hayes understood that she was being told that such capabilities existed in sufficient numbers to address current threats, but that specific details about personnel and deployment remained compartmentalized beyond her authority level. It was both reassuring and unsettling to know that American forces were protected by systems she couldn't directly control or coordinate. Mitchell presented the final element of the intelligence assessment, showing communication intercepts that revealed enemy awareness of their losses and operational adjustments based on the elimination of their specialist teams. Enemy forces have suspended planned operations and are conducting comprehensive security reviews. They're aware that their specialists are being hunted by capabilities they don't understand. The psychological impact worked both ways, Hayes realized. Just as enemy specialists had been deployed to erode American confidence, the systematic elimination of those specialists was now affecting enemy planning and operational confidence. Fear of unknown American capabilities was forcing enemy forces to adopt the same defensive postures they had intended to impose on American troops. Chun closed his folder with the finality that suggested the briefing was concluding. Ongoing. Operations continue to monitor and address identified threats. Coordination with conventional forces remains flexible based on tactical requirements and security considerations. Hayes understood that she was being dismissed from discussions of operational details that required clearances she didn't possess. But she also understood that American forces were being protected by capabilities that operated beyond her knowledge or control, using methods that existed in the classified realm between official policy and practical necessity. After the briefing, Hayes walked through Pentagon corridors with a new understanding of the complexity surrounding modern military operations. Conventional forces like those she commanded operated within established structures and procedures, but they were supported by systems that existed outside those frameworks when situations required exceptional responses. She thought about Colonel Morrison's decision to authorize unconventional support for the trapped Marines at Checkpoint Delta, recognizing that his willingness to trust capabilities he didn't understand had contributed to preventing a strategic disaster. His tactical decision had enabled strategic operations that protected American forces worldwide. Hayes returned to her office with questions that had no conventional answers and responsibilities that extended beyond her direct authority. She commanded conventional forces operating in an unconventional world, protected by capabilities she couldn't officially acknowledge but whose effectiveness was undeniable. Her secure communication system activated with updates from field commanders. REPORTI and G continued decreases in enemy specialist activity across all theaters of operation. The systematic elimination of foreign military advisors had forced enemy forces to rely on less capable personnel and conventional tactics that American forces were better equipped to counter. Morrison's name appeared in promotion recommendations that crossed her desk, with notations indicating his demonstrated ability to integrate conventional and unconventional capabilities during complex operations. His experience with specialized assets had marked him as someone who could operate effectively in the gray areas where traditional military doctrine met practical necessity. Hayes approved the recommendation, understanding that effective command in the modern environment required officers who could accept solutions that existed outside established frameworks. Morrison had proven his ability to trust capabilities he couldn't control, while maintaining responsibility for conventional forces that depended on results rather than procedures. The broader implications of the intelligence briefing continued to resonate as Hayes reviewed reports from subordinate commands. American forces were operating more confidently in contested areas, conducting missions with reduced concern about precision threats that had previously constrained their operational effectiveness. The psychological impact of successful counter-operations was enabling strategic initiatives that had been considered too risky when enemy specialists posed unaddressed threats. American forces were regaining tactical initiative because someone in the classified realm had eliminated the precision threats that conventional responses couldn't adequately address. Hayes understood that she would never know the details of operations that protected her forces, never meet the personnel who conducted missions in the spaces between official policy and practical necessity. But she also understood that her responsibility as a conventional commander included accepting the existence of capabilities that operated beyond her authority when situations required exceptional responses. The specialized assets Chun had described continued their invisible patrol, moving through hostile territory like ghosts, hunting ghosts in a war that officially didn't exist, but never really ended. They served in the classified spaces where the most important battles were fought and won, protecting conventional forces through methods that couldn't be acknowledged or officially recognized. Hayes realized that Maria Santos represented something larger than individual capability. She embodied systems that enabled American forces to operate effectively against threats that conventional military doctrine couldn't adequately address. Her legend would continue to grow among the Marines she had protected, but her real significance lay in the strategic capability she represented. The desert winds continued to sweep across forward operating bases where American forces conducted their missions with renewed confidence, protected by guardians they would never see and supported by capabilities they couldn't imagine. The silent snipers remained invisible, serving in the shadows where legends were born and the most important victories were achieved without fanfare or recognition. Maria Santos had become more than legend. She had become proof that some battles could only be won by warriors willing to serve without recognition, operate without oversight, and sacrifice without acknowledgement. In the end, her greatest victory was not the enemy she had eliminated, but the confidence she had restored to the warriors who served in the light while she fought in the darkness. The war continued on multiple fronts, but American forces now moved with the assurance that came from knowing they were protected by capabilities that exceeded their enemy's understanding. Somewhere in the classified realm beyond conventional authority, specialized assets maintained their eternal vigilance, ensuring that threats would be eliminated before they could endanger the warriors, whose names would appear in official records and whose service would be publicly honored. Hayes closed the intelligence reports and returned to the routine business of commanding conventional forces, but with the knowledge that her decisions were supported by systems that operated in the spaces between the rules were the most important. Work was accomplished by those who chose mission over recognition, honor over acknowledgement, and service over self. 2 years had passed since the Checkpoint Delta incident, and the Marine Corps had quietly instituted new training protocols that acknowledged realities most textbooks never addressed. At the Advanced Infantry Training School in Quantico, instructors now taught courses on operating with unconventional support elements and asymmetric friendly capabilities, without ever explicitly defining what those terms meant in practice. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh stood before a classroom of young Marines, holding a training manual that contained lessons learned from incidents that officially never happened. Her students represented the next generation of warriors who would deploy to contested regions where conventional tactics met unconventional realities. The modern battlefield presents challenges that require flexible thinking, Walsh explained to the attentive faces before her. Sometimes you'll receive support from assets that don't appear on any organizational chart. Your job is to complete your mission and bring your Marines home, regardless of how that support manifests. One of the students raised his hand with the kind of direct question that characterized Marine training. Staff Sergeant, how do we coordinate with assets we can't identify through normal communication channels? Walsh smiled, remembering her own confusion during her first deployment, when impossible things happened with no explanation. Corporal, you maintain situational awareness and adapt to developing circumstances. When threats are eliminated and your tactical situation improves unexpectedly, you exploit the advantage and accomplish your mission. The training reflected broader changes throughout the military establishment as institutional knowledge evolved to accommodate capabilities that existed outside traditional frameworks. Officers learned to plan operations that included contingencies for specialized intervention, while maintaining focus on conventional objectives and standard procedures. Colonel Morrison, now serving at the Pentagon in a staff position that bridged conventional and special operations planning, reviewed intelligence summaries that painted a transformed threat environment. Enemy forces had largely abandoned the use of foreign military specialists after suffering systematic losses that they couldn't explain or prevent. The psychological impact of unknown American capabilities had forced enemy organizations to rely on less effective conventional tactics, providing decisive advantages to American forces operating in contested regions. Fear of invisible hunters had become a strategic weapon that influenced enemy planning and operational confidence. Morrison understood that Maria Santos and others like her had achieved something remarkable. They had fundamentally altered the calculus of asymmetric warfare by demonstrating that American forces possessed capabilities that exceeded enemy understanding. The legend had become strategic reality. His secure communication system displayed a message from field commanders, reporting another successful operation in which enemy sniper teams had been eliminated before they could engage American forces. The clinical language of the report couldn't convey the human reality of lives saved and families preserved, but Morrison understood what each successful mission represented. Somewhere in the classified realm beyond conventional authority, specialized assets continued their invisible patrol, hunting threats that conventional forces couldn't engage using methods that textbooks couldn't teach. They served without recognition, operated without oversight, and sacrificed without acknowledgement because the mission demanded nothing less. The Marine Corps' memorial stood silent in the afternoon light, its bronze figures frozen in eternal struggle as visitors paid respects to warriors whose sacrifices had preserved the freedom others enjoyed. Among the countless names engraved in stone were those of Marines who had died at places like Checkpoint Delta, saved by guardians they never saw. Maria Santos walked among the memorials with the quiet reverence of someone who understood the true cost of the freedoms others took for granted. She wore civilian clothes and carried no identification that would connect her to the classified world where she served. But her presence honored warriors whose names would be remembered when her own was forgotten. She paused before the section dedicated to Marines killed in recent conflicts, reading names of warriors who had died in the kind of precision attacks her missions were designed to prevent. Each name represented a family destroyed, a future ended, a sacrifice that demanded answering in kind. A young Marine in dress blues approached the memorial carrying flowers for a fallen comrade, his movements reflecting the grief that came with losing someone who had become family. Maria watched him place the flowers with careful precision, maintaining military bearing even as tears traced silent paths down his cheeks. He noticed her observing and straightened, uncertain whether he should acknowledge a civilian at what felt like a private moment. Maria nodded with the kind of understanding that transcended words, recognizing in his eyes the pain that came with surviving when others didn't. He was a good Marine, the young warrior said quietly, gesturing toward the name engraved in stone. Died in an ambush in Syria. Enemy sniper got him before anyone could react. Maria felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the cold certainty that demanded action against those who targeted American warriors. He won't be forgotten, she replied with quiet conviction. None of them will be. The young Marine nodded and walked away, leaving Maria alone with thoughts of missions yet to be completed and enemies who had not yet answered for their crimes against American forces. Her encrypted phone vibrated with coordinates for her next assignment, another threat that required elimination by someone willing to operate in the spaces between official policy and practical necessity. She looked up at the bronze figures reaching toward a flag that would never fall, understanding that her service was part of an unbroken chain that connected warriors across generations. Each mission she completed honored those who had fallen while protecting those who would continue the fight. Maria left the memorial and walked toward a nondescript vehicle that would carry her to whatever conflict zone required her particular combination of skills and moral flexibility. Behind her, visitors continued paying respects to warriors whose sacrifices had made such visits possible, protected by guardians they would never know existed. The legend of the silent sniper lived on in the stories Marines told in forward operating bases and training facilities, spreading through generations of warriors who understood that some battles were won by those who chose to remain invisible. But Maria Santos herself remained a ghost, serving in the classified shadows where the most important work was accomplished without fanfare or recognition. At Marine Corps bases around the world, young warriors learned their trade while older. Marines shared stories about guardian angels who appeared when situations seemed hopeless. The institutional knowledge grew organically, passing from mentor to student, the understanding that American forces were protected by capabilities that exceeded conventional understanding. The war continued on multiple fronts, but American Marines moved with confidence born from the knowledge that threats would be eliminated before they could endanger those who served in the light. Somewhere in the darkness beyond their vision, specialized assets maintained eternal vigilance, ensuring that the warriors whose names would appear in official records could focus on their missions without fear of precision threats from invisible enemies. Maria Santos had become more than legend. She had become proof that some victories required warriors willing to serve without recognition, operate without constraints, and sacrifice without acknowledgement. Her greatest triumph was not the enemy she had eliminated, but the confidence she had restored to generations of Marines who would never know her name but would benefit from her service. The silent sniper continued her eternal patrol, moving through hostile territory like smoke through ruins, eliminating threats that conventional forces couldn't engage. She served in the spaces between the rules where legends were born, and the most important battles were fought by those who chose honor over recognition, mission over glory, and service over self. In the end, her legacy lived not in the stories told about her, but in the Marines who came home alive because someone had been willing to become invisible so that they could remain visible. The ghost had become guardian, and the guardian had become eternal, serving in the classified shadows where heroes were made and legends were born. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.